Welcome to the Neurofaith Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Thompson, and we are here to explore what it means to live at the intersection of emerging scientific discoveries about the mind and following and being formed by Jesus, and how that can lead us into a world of greater human flourishing. We are eager to hear from our guests not only about the work they are doing, but how it speaks to what it means for us to thrive in our present particular moment. Today, my guest on the Neurofaith Podcast is psychologist Justin Barrett. Dr. Barrett is the founder and president of Blueprint 1543. Founded in 2019, Blueprint 1543's mission is to enable people to use the sciences to accelerate excellent contributions from Christians to life's biggest questions. Dr. Barrett holds a doctorate in cognitive and developmental psychology from Cornell University, is a fellow of the International Society for Science and Religion, and is an expert in the cognitive science of religion, cognitive approaches to the study of culture, and religious development in children. He is the author of Born Believers, The Science of Children's Religious Belief, and, most recently, Thriving with Stone Age Minds, Evolutionary Psychology, Christian Faith, and the Quest for Human Flourishing. Dr. Barrett, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
So I would love to hear some about your story and how you've come to be where you are.
You know, I grew up in a Christian home, but I was a sort of outdoorsy, nerdy kind of kid, which means I spent a lot of time outdoor looking at animals and plants and things. And I was fascinated by biology, especially big systems level kind of stuff. And thought I would go into a science area. I was one of those weird kids who would use salt dough that you make at home to make like models of organs and things like that. Or I would, if we found a rattlesnake on our back step, then, you know, my dad would dispatch with it, but then I would dissect it, you know, that kind of stuff. And so I got to college. I went to Calvin College, now Calvin University, because I found it important to take a faith perspective on doing my work. But at the same time, Calvin, didn't outlaw dancing and, things like that. So, and didn't require chapel. So, I was pragmatic about this as well. But there, I was forced to take an intro to psychology class. And I had no idea that there was this scientific side of studying human minds, brains, behavior, and I was captivated by it. So that won my affections. I continued down that kind of nerdy path of being a scientist, but in this new area. And one of the things that, I started reading a little bit in psychology of religion, and it became clear to me that the study of how people think about God and their religious thought was understudied, at least by the people in the sciences who specialize in thinking, that is, cognitive scientists and cognitive psychologists. And so I, as a grad student or would-be grad student, I was looking for a place I could study, take a cognitive science approach to studying how people think about God. That was my primary interest when I got started. And I found an advisor who hadn't done anything like that, Frank Kyle at Cornell University. And he agreed to sort of supervise the project just because he thought this sounds interesting, not because he had any particular expertise in the area, but he was a broad enough, flexible thinker. They thought this sounds like fun. Now, he did have a condition for me. He said, look, you can study this religion stuff. And I also wanted to do it cross-culturally. And he said, that's fine too, but you got to take a developmental approach. And I didn't know at the time, but I learned shortly thereafter he was emphasizing this developmental approach because in his experience as a cognitive scientist, some of these really complex areas are better approached developmentally. That is, we can sometimes get insights into our mature situation by looking at, well, how did we get here? How did it come together? Sometimes you can get answers to the big questions in that space easier from a developmental perspective than you can other ways.
So I'm just a real quick question for our audience.
Yeah.
When you use the phrase a developmental perspective. Can you just be a little more detailed, unpack that?
In this context, developmental means we're going to look at how in the course of human development, in a lifetime of an individual, a certain way of thinking comes together. So we might start at infancy, or we might start in sort of later early childhood. So I was in a lab group that 4, 5, 6-year-olds were the old kids.
Wow.
We go, oh yeah, and then we've got those old ones, those 6-year-olds. They're really, really old because there were infant researchers in the lab group I was in who they're studying 5-month-olds and how do 5-month-olds think. I'm like, well, how do you even do that? It's really hard because, half of your subjects wet themselves or cry and fuss out, as they say. Fall asleep in the middle of the study.
Oh, my gracious.
So I became impressed with, even though I was reluctant at first, that, wow, it is really helpful to look at, well, how do kids think about God? What kind of equipment do they have in their heads that help them to start thinking about God and prayer or, divine sort of action in the world and all these other kinds of topics. I was mostly focused on God concepts and how we think about that. But yeah, so that's how I kind of got going in this area.
Yeah. Well, and I know you are known for your book, Born Believers. And for our audience, Born Believers, The Science of Children's Religious Belief. Tell us about what you discovered. What would be some really important, captivating concepts that book really covers? And what would you love for our audience to hear that comes from that study?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest sort of highlights is children don't gravitate toward religious thought, believing in God or other kinds of religious thought because of heavy indoctrination. So there's this common narrative out there in the culture that to get kids to believe in God, you got to really sort of drill it into them and threaten them with eternal damnation, or they're going nowhere near this stuff. You got to be really
what a pleasant picture.
Yeah, exactly.
Believe in God, right? Pull out your fingernails.
Well, yeah, something like that, right?
Right.
And what I and other folks working in cognitive science of religion have started uncovering, I think, is evidence to the contrary. That, look, the thinking about God, afterlife, some kind of, immaterial soul or something separable from me, and all these other religious concepts are actually pretty easy for kids. It's almost a conceptual path of least resistance. So it's not that we need to work really hard to get them to think this way. It doesn't take much. It would take more work to get them to not think about these things. I think is the biggest take home. And then what the book tries to do is break that down into, okay, yeah, why is that? What are the sort of natural ways of thinking, understanding the world, interacting with other people that make children so susceptible to religious thought? And now, susceptible there shouldn't sound negative. That could be positive. I want to be fairly neutral with that because there's a big space here for the particulars of what kinds of God concepts or ideas of God that are filled in by parents, by the greater culture, and so forth. And some of those could be good, some could be bad or indifferent. My focus in the book is on what are the basic structures that develop early in life that just make us sort of, oh, hey, this fits. Thinking about God kind of just intuitively makes sense to me.
I'm curious to know, what would you say as far as children's own development? What helps them separate out those paths of belief that have to do with God and paths of belief that have to do with other things that also naturally occur in childhood, but that eventually that they grow out of? For instance, a child will, my kids are 31 and 28. I don't think they believe in Santa Claus anymore. But at some point, most kids will say, "I know that's a story that we've made up. Santa Claus is." What would you say? How help us understand? What separates in children's minds? How do they differentiate between those things that are worth continuing to hold, and those things that they would say, "Yes, at one point in time that was a thing I believed, but I don't believe that anymore"?
Yeah, that's good. I once actually wrote an article called "Why Santa Claus is Not a God," which was one of the more fun things to write in some ways. Santa Claus, Father Christmas, whatever we want to call this guy, has a lot of the right features that make him attractive, but he doesn't have all of them. So the short answer is God has a lot deeper intuitive hooks than Santa Claus does.
Could you name a couple of those?
Yeah. So, for instance, when there's evidence, especially from Deborah Kellerman's lab, Deborah Kellerman at Boston University, she's provided a lot of evidence, she and her collaborators, that children naturally look around the world. In fact, all of us naturally look around the world and see design and purpose around us. So it's easy for us to think, it's automatic for us to think, oh, that tree has that shape for a particular reason. That mountain actually is the way it is for a particular reason. That river does what it does for a reason. There are purposes, design behind everything. And we readily attach that design or purpose to someone intended it for a reason.
So you might even say that even though like a 6 or 8-year-old wouldn't use this word, that teleology is kind of in the back of their mind.
That's right. The really awkward word that Kellerman sometimes uses is teleofunctional reasoning, but yes, it is teleology out there. She has also used the term promiscuous teleology because there's this tendency to see purpose, design all over the place. And like I said, and it makes most sense to think, well, if it has a purpose, someone purposed it. And to attach that for not only why it is the way it is, but maybe even why it is even here at all is because of a purpose. Now, that sort of intuitive notion that's lurking around, another one is that things happen for reasons, events have a purpose behind them. Those fit better with a concept like a creator God than they do with a seasonal Santa Claus, right? Who doesn't account for anything except for maybe the number and quality of the gifts under the tree.
Right.
So he's got a much more circumscribed kind of explanatory role in the world, let's say. The other thing to notice is parents actually have to work to get kids to believe in Santa. They don't have to work too hard because there's a lot of motivation to believe in Santa Claus, right? But it is a ruse that people will play on their kids, whereas God isn't a ruse. Okay, the evidence for God is already out there. You don't have to manufacture it. Right. And it sort of fits these natural hooks really well. I sometimes compare it to, that preschool shape sorter kind of toy, and it's, you put the little round one in the round hole and the square one in the square hole.
That's right. Yep.
That one. The way that our minds develop seem to create a conceptual space, various conceptual spaces that are waiting for the right shaped thing to be put into them by the cultural environment. And it sure looks like we've got this sort of God-shaped space waiting for that cultural input.
Yes, indeed. So you're giving us such rich information about children, and I think that our audience, many in our audience, might be surprised to hear that, in fact, there is a neurally correlated, developmentally correlated pattern that children are already kind of coming to the table with in this way. And they do, from what I'm hearing you say, they do have a sense of sorting. That would be my word, of sorting the difference between Santa Claus and God in terms of the ways that you've described. I'm wondering, for those parents who are listening, who are perhaps anxious, by anxious meaning there's the slight undercurrent of longing mixed with worry about how can we therefore take this natural this naturally occurring inclination. How do we most effectively shepherd that? How do we guide that in ways that lead children to a faith that is robust? And what are some things that we don't want to be doing that might interfere with that process? Recognizing, of course, that we can't absolutely guarantee outcomes. But I would really be curious to know, what are some ways in which we can foster and strengthen those kinds of notions that you're already describing kids come equipped with to begin with?
I guess my suggestion for parents is to first of all recognize that children are going to think along these pathways. They're going to wonder, or at least in the background, have wonders about why things are the way they are, why things happen the way they do, about this character that they occasionally hear about who's called God and what's God like. And we don't need to be afraid of that, but we need to recognize what's easy for them. And, I was describing that conceptual space. You want to, put God in the right conceptual space, but what you, I think, don't want to do is maybe push too hard. And you also want to be aware of where slippage can happen. What do I mean by that? Because there's a tendency toward thinking about things in the world as having purposes and design, events as having causes and so forth. It's also, I suspect, very easy for all of us, not just children, but all of us to start attributing to God things that maybe we shouldn't, right? Because we see purpose in lots of different things, it's easy to maybe over-cultivate that and think, oh, so God wanted me to steal this toy from my brother because it worked out really well for me.
I haven't thought about this, but Justin, now that you've given me this idea, I think I want to run with this.
But when we feel the sort of pull to, oh yeah, this just makes sense because God has all of these purposes worked out in our lives in such a micro level. Well, let's check that impulse. Does that sound right? Does that make sense? And children, that's adults or kids, right? So that's one kind of slight caution I'd add. But on the positive side, I'd encourage parents to just spend time with kids outside, looking at the natural world, talking about it, reflecting on its beauty, its design, and so forth, and making that attribution of God. Yeah, God has brought about this really amazing world that sort of has all of these interlocking parts that have purposes that we see. God is a really good account for those. And I think it's perfectly all right to cultivate that kind of thinking. Another bit of advice that I'd suggest is to help children start distinguishing between God's attributes and those of other minded, intentional beings. I think kids can handle this a lot earlier than most parents realize.
So for our audience, other intentional minded beings.
Oh yeah, that's kind of awkward, isn't it? I just mean like awkward. People.
No. It's just it's such a beautiful phrase. It really, like, it's elegant. It's beautiful. And I want our audience to really hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, so other people, Santa Claus, ghosts, children. More than half of children are probably going to have an invisible friend, for instance. Those are other minded, intentional beings that they conceptualize. So what makes God different than these others? When I look at like Sunday school curricula, I'm often sort of dismayed that there seems to be an assumption that until kids are about 8 years old, all they can do is, learn moralistic Bible stories, or I should say Bible stories that have been heavily moralized by us.
Right.
And no, they can do more than that. They can actually think about, God knows things that mom doesn't know. God can see things that, the pastor can't see. I was speaking of pastors, right? Something that developmental psychologists have noticed who study religious development is that it's not uncommon for kids to mistake the pastor for God. That's embarrassing to pastors most of the time, but it should be embarrassing to all of us because it suggests that somehow the way that we treat the pastor, the way that we arrange life around the pastor exalts the person to a point that kids are making this mistake. That should be a warning sign to us.
Right.
And we should correct that one gently.
Right.
Pastor Bob is great, but no, not God.
Right. So related to what you've just been reflecting, I'm also really curious about how we approach our children, imagining, thinking of them developmentally when painful things happen. when things happen that can easily be attributed to God that are actually not very pleasant? How do we help them navigate loss? How do we help them navigate grief? How do we help them navigate painful circumstances? And how does their conceptualization of God play a role in that?
Ooh, wow. That's the tough question that guys like me usually try to stay clear of. That's for people who actually have psychological skills to help people, right? They wrestle with those. This makes me think there's an important relational backdrop. In my research, I do focus on, well, what are the nuts and bolts of sort of the thinking machine in people's heads that make them, think religiously or not. But I'm not unaware that one of the best predictors of whether a child is going to grow up with a relationship with God, if their parents are, say, Christ followers, for instance, is actually the warmth of the parents and their relationship with their children. Some studies suggest maybe that actually the father's warmth is particularly important. Maybe because mothers are just sort of at ceiling levels most of the time already, and it's dad who is the wild card. But
thanks. It's nice to know kind of what my kids are really wondering about me.
Right.
we know we can count on mom. Dad.
Yeah. There is something to that. Right?
Yeah.
Moms usually are there. Dads a little more. In the jargon, right? They can explain. There's more variance, we would say.
Oh my gosh, Justin is so nicely played. So nicely played.
Kids who have who perceive their parents as warm, as responsive, who have, again, in more jargon of the field that you're familiar with, have a secure attachment with their parents, are likely to just sort of have a nice gradual maturation in their relationship with God. And so with that as a backdrop, there's more relational currency, there's more comfort and security in having those hard conversations about, why did grandma die? Why did my friend move away? Why were those kids at school mean to me? Why didn't God step up and protect me in all of these? Now, I actually don't think kids usually ask that particular question. Adults ask that question. I don't find that most kids really are wrestling with the problem of evil or sin in the world because they haven't built up this expectation that everything is supposed to be perfect. They're inheriting that from their parents as well, potentially. If mom and dad are complaining about everything and, things aren't going my way and they really ought to, then that can be contagious too. Kids start, wrestling with that. But what kids, I think, need more than answers in that situation is compassion, right? Assurance that even if, honey, I don't know why these things are happening. And if they're asking about God, I don't know why God lets these things happen, but he does. And here's some things that have happened in my life. And while it sure wasn't fun at the time, here's why it ended up good for me in the end. I think those conversations are ones that surprisingly young kids can start moving into that space. Again, cautiously, but that's me speaking more as a dad than a therapist.
Sure.
So,
yeah, absolutely.
With that caution.
Absolutely. That's beautiful. Well, I'd love to move our conversation a little bit. Since you wrote Born Believers, you founded, as we said earlier, you founded a company called Blueprint 1543, which aims to encourage and energize faith through scientific discovery. I'd love to hear you talk about that, what led you to start it, and how has your experience in cognitive development informed what you're doing there?
Yeah, so one of the things I discovered in my work in what's now known as the cognitive science of religion is I couldn't just leave it at the sort of the basic research end of things. People started getting excited about, well, what are the implications of this area of scientific research for, child rearing, for religious education, for worship? or in a more negative sense, for the rationality or justification for religious beliefs. So these interesting philosophical and theological questions started coming up that I felt a certain burden to say something about. When the new atheist movement took off, a lot of them were big fans of the cognitive science of religion and saw in cognitive science of religion, saw in even my work, tools that they could use to try to dissuade people from, believing in God, from following Christ. And I'm like, well, okay, I'm not. I don't see the science as justifying that, but who's going to help? So I got involved in that conversation and started learning more about that side of things, and so that led me eventually into a position at Fuller Seminary, where I was co-directing our office for science, theology, and religion initiatives, the STAR office, we called it. And so that became a bigger part of what I was doing, is helping faith communities, particularly Christian faith communities, understand where the challenges, but also the promise, the resources in the sciences are for enhancing, invigorating our faith in some important ways, and also how theology actually raises some really interesting questions and problems that I wish scientists would wrestle with a little bit more.
Well, I would love for you to speak a little bit about that, about what some of those questions are, and where you're finding your own work to be invigorating for you around the particulars of that mission.
I think the kind of success story that I like to point to is what is known as the positive psychology movement. So in psychology, traditionally, there's been a focus on what goes wrong.
Of course. As is often the case as we like to say, we are, when I was in medical school, we had no other course occupied more real estate than our pathology course.
Right, exactly. And, the same is the case in psychology. There's a strong emphasis on pathology, and not just amongst clinical and counseling psychologists, but even among, say, social psychologists. There's been a tendency to really focus on, say, how groups make us violent or lead us to really bad behaviors, or in more cognitive kind of areas of how broken our perception system is and how it gets things wrong, or our reasoning system is and how we get things wrong. So there's this real emphasis on our failures as humans. The positive psychology movement has said, okay, that's fine and dandy. That's important work, but can we also spend a little time looking at what we do well, and maybe how we can enhance what we do well instead of just being less miserable? Can we be more excellent in character strengths and virtues? And so there's been this movement over the past roughly 20, 25 years of positive psychology, looking at things like gratitude and forgiveness and patience and self-control. And one of the things that is not hard to notice if you have eyes to see it is that most of the heavy hitters in this area are people of faith. Not all of them, but far more in that space than in the rest of psychology, research psychology. And that's not an accident, because those heavy hitters are drawing upon theological traditions, mostly Christian, but sometimes Jewish and other theological traditions, to motivate their scientific exploration. They're like, they're resources from the great thinkers and scripture around things like topics like forgiveness, self-control, gratitude, that then have helped stimulate and guide their research. They're not just trying to confirm the theology, but they are inspired by the theology.
Yeah. It's striking to me, even as you're speaking, two things come to mind. One is, and especially when you mention positive psychology, as parents, when we are encountering our children, if we are paying attention, there is a great deal that begins to emerge with them that is like this energy that our job is just to direct, and not that there's not going to be pruning, not that there's not going to be restraint. Of course, there's going to be all of that. But this notion that we don't typically have our children come out of the womb and we suddenly just start to pay attention to what's wrong with them. We don't typically tend to pathologize them. I mean, the first time the child smiles, we're just like enamored with this. The first time the child walks, there are all these things that we are paying attention to that the child is actually doing well in terms of how we are anticipating, even conceptualizing and imaging the child's development. And at some point, there's a turn in this regard. And I'm struck by how what you're talking about right now, in some respects, circles all the way back around to our beginning parts of our conversation about the role that children play in reminding us as adults about what it means to be human.
Oh, that's nice.
And moreover, it also strikes me when we imagine, and at least it strikes, I guess, strikes me, about when we hear Jesus speak multiple times in the Gospels, when he's confronting his disciples who are having trouble with children being in Jesus' presence, when he says things like, unless you change and become like little children, you can't enter the kingdom of heaven. Or where he says, suffer the children to come unto me, allow them to come unto me. And also acknowledging how hard it is to actually do that for the disciples. It's hard. You're going to have to suffer this. And I want to say that the work that you've done, not just in articulating, the research, the hard work of research, and then the articulation of this, and now taking this and applying this in the larger landscape in your new company, this notion that we are taking the strengths of what it means for us to be children as Jesus has called us to be, and to be curious and imaginative about how do we then live into that as adults. And I just love what the premise of your company is and the energy behind it. I was looking at your website and the people who are involved and the number of different elements of it. And as we get to the end of our time, I just wanted to know, was there anything else about that project that you're really excited about that you'd love our listeners to hear about?
Wow, how do I pick one thing? It's like choosing amongst your children, which is your favorite.
Well, I know but we all know that we have one, so it's okay.
Well, at least everybody else knows that you have one. You're not hiding it as well as you think you are. I'll tell you, I feel really fortunate that I've been able to focus on what Blueprint 1543 is doing. I do have a great team of people around me, and we are having an awful lot of fun, especially sort of our current big project is helping equip theologians to engage the sciences more fully, more robustly, to help in their work along the lines as we've been discussing. I mean, some theologians are starting to identify the point that you just made, that there's something about even having children in worship with us that changes adult worship. It's not just, what's good for the kids, but what's good for the community, thanks to the kids being there. Dean Blevins and Josh Cockane have been doing some work on that as theologians. It's wonderful. And it's so fun to feel like we're helping theologians just do better theology because of their engagement with the sciences. And we've started shifting now to the other side of that coin and looking at, well, what does it take to make theologically engaged scientists who can also contribute to these theological spaces, these problems that are important for the church, for just encouraging flourishing, not only in church communities, but globally. How do we get scientists to start really appreciating the contributions from theology and making their own contributions back? That's a planning project we're working on currently. So we're starting to talk to lots of we're saying human scientists, so psychologists, psychiatrists, neuroscientists, sociologists, biological anthropologists, lots of different kinds of scientists about what are the challenges of engaging theological work, making contributions either as collaborators or independently, what motivates them, what gets in the way of their motivation. So we're having a lot of fun there as well. And hopefully we're still a new outfit. We're getting our feet under us, but we sure are having a lot of fun. And hopefully within a year or two, we'll be able to say, wow, it really feels like we're making a contribution and helping to change the landscape of how folks in the church think about the sciences and how folks in the sciences think about their faith and how it can energize their work.
That's beautiful. Dr. Barrett, I would love for you, if people who are listening to this are more interested in your work and they want to get in, or if they want to get in touch with you or your organization, what would be some ways that would be helpful for people to access your work or to make contact?
Yeah, the easiest way to go is to go to our website, so www.blueprint1543.org, and you can go to the connect button there, browse around, check out our stuff. We have some free, actually online course material as well, and other kinds of resources that we're putting up there. But mostly, you can shoot an email to my team there, and that's probably the easiest way.
It has been a pleasure, and I want to just wish you every success. I think about the work that you're doing, and I think in terms of the beauty and goodness that we were, made to create in the world. And I'm imagining that the work that you're doing personally, the team that you've gathered, and the work at Blueprint 1543 is doing is going to be one more outpost of beauty and goodness in the world that God will use to declare to the world that he's in love with it and that he's come to find it. And so with that in mind, Dr. Barrett, thank you so much for being with us on the podcast today.
Well, thanks for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
You've been listening to the NeuroFaith Podcast, where today my guest has been Dr. Justin Barrett. I'm Kurt Thompson. Thanks so much for joining us. I look forward to being with you at our next episode. Until then.